Urban Planning Economic Development Studio at the University at Buffalo. On behalf of the studio, I would like to thank everyone for attending our presentation today. COVID-19 and evictions in the Rust Belt, grounding policy recommendations in mixed method analysis. The pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated the inequitable outcomes of the American housing system, particularly a worsening eviction crisis. This report synthesizes economic analysis, spatial data, stakeholder interviews, news media analysis, and policy literature review to propose programs and policies to prevent evictions and improve housing stability in Buffalo, New York, Detroit, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In particular, the combination of economic and spatial analyses reveals industries and neighborhoods that are linked to heightened eviction risk, and those that can be leveraged to stabilize local housing markets. This studio acknowledges the prominence of structural systemic racism and has used equity as a guiding principle in the process of creating our policy proposals. Therefore, we ask our audience to keep in mind that the negative impacts discussed in our presentation today have a greater impact on marginalized and low-income communities. We ask that you please hold your questions and comments until the end of the presentation, but feel free to post them in the chat box, and we will get to as many as we can. The layout of this presentation will start with an overview of each city, then our methods section, next our findings and existing policy evaluations, which will lead us to our recommendations and concluding sections. Ashley Hudson will take it away with an overview of each city.
Thank you, Jackson. So why did we choose the cities Buffalo, Detroit, and Pittsburgh? Well, in recent years, each city has experienced a sense of resurgence. In the context of our housing and eviction-related research, the cities share a long-lasting history of race and class segregation. All three cities have a strong industrial history as well as distinct demographic variables that altogether shapes the narrative that each city holds. Detroit is known as the Motor City, with its automobile manufacturing heritage, and is also demographically known for being predominantly a minority city. Following is Pittsburgh, which is cemented in its history as a steel city for its former dominance in steel production, and is demographically predominantly white. Lastly is Buffalo, the Queen City of the Lake, whose legacy is grain shipping and storage. Buffalo demographically is split down the middle. Each city has attempted to diversify their deindustrialized economic profiles by taking a unique approach to urban revitalization. Our report will seek to examine the consequences of such actions on housing affordability and evictions. And now speaking will be Justin.
Thank you, Ashley. The Rust Belt study area that our three cities lie within presents a unique socioeconomic and historical canvas. Simply put, it is the agglomeration of older industrial urban communities surrounding the Great Lakes with a legacy of high manufacturing location quotients that have since struggled to grow since the mid-century. The nucleus stretches from the east in upstate New York all the way in the west to southeastern Wisconsin. Also, there are several outlier cities and regions, including St. Louis and Baltimore. The cities within this zone, they share many of the same characteristics that have left a lasting impact on their built environment as well as their residents. The underlying motif is a blue-collar ethos and a manufacturing heritage, even if the might of industry has since waned. Deindustrialization has created conditions for job loss, factory closure, shrinking populations, and aging demographics. While many cities have finally stabilized from their mass exoduses, they still suffer from brain drains and stagnant economic growth, mainly marked by a lack of income movement. As historic centers of immigration from Europe and Black migration from the South, the region has its share of diversity, yet behind these migratory patterns lies enduring race and class segregation. Finally, a unique Rust Belt urban structure contains some of the oldest housing stock in the country, high vacancy, and a pattern of settlement where neighborhoods are actively anchored by factories. While the Rust Belt evokes American heartland sentiment, it is by no means a purely American phenomenon. In fact, the Rust Belt is a global archetype with analogous regions of deindustrialization around the world. including in the United Kingdom, in Japan, in Western Europe, Russia, and even China. In order for our focus cities to rust, they must first be forged. While each has a unique narrative, there are common threads that unite all three of their trajectories. The providential geography of Buffalo, Detroit, and Pittsburgh have gifted each with access to resources and a comparative advantage for their dominant industries. As some of the earliest industrial cities, the demand for labor created rapid urbanization that reached a critical point around the Civil War. Over decades of robust growth, immigration from Europe and migration from the South fueled city expansion and divided urban areas along racial, class, and cultural lines. These cities reached their peak productivity at the tail end of World War II after serving as the arsenal of democracy for the Allied War campaign and later on as engines of post-war consumerism. Post-war, much of these defense industries were strategically decentralized, while modernist planning practices simultaneously divested from urban cores. Meanwhile, veteran home loans and new transportation networks catalyzed suburbanization. Between 1950 and 1960, each city's population peaked. For the populace left in the city proper, racial tensions flared, and urban renewal projects attempted to redevelop increasingly shrinking downtowns, often relocating many longtime residents. The following decades marked by despair brought about job loss, factory closures, and continued outmigration. Inequitable development created increasingly sprawling cities despite a dearth of growth. A collection of global factors combined to form a disastrous result for the newly coined Rust Belt region, painting it as a victim of both globalization and neoliberalism. Mired in economic stagnation, these cities emerged from the Great Recession with the new smart growth initiatives to diversify their industrial profiles and reinvest in urban life. While civic power brokers selected pathways unique to their city's strengths, an eds and meds strategy was established as the consensus for growth. Despite rhetoric of their demise, the last decade of momentum changed public perceptions of the triumvirate cities and heralded the talk of a Rust Belt revival. In our present season of COVID disruption, the resilience and revitalization narrative of each city is under threat, once again revealing systemic economic disparities, including evictions, that are masked by renewed optimism. Continuing with the theme of these cities will be Jackson.
Thank you, Justin. Looking at the decennial total population graph of the three cities, you can see the periods of growth and decay. You can see, like other Rust Belt cities, these periods took place at similar times in history. The general timelines of these periods are centered around industrialization, post-World War II development and suburbanization, then the process of urban sprawl and decentralization, bringing these cities to the present day of revitalization and/or population stabilization. You can also see that Detroit is the largest city, Buffalo is the smallest city, and Pittsburgh sits in the middle of the two. Now, Zach Karosh will be introducing our methods section.
Thank you, Jackson. We use the mixed methods approach to analyze our study areas and connect policy and programming to its tangible impacts on each city, especially with respect to eviction and the role economic development plays in perpetuating inequalities. Our class used economic analysis, spatial analysis, interview and news media coding, and policy review to uncover details about each of the three cities. I'll now be handing it off to Josh to discuss the PICS analysis.
Thank you, Zach. One of the methods we used for our PICS analysis was gathering data from the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis website, where we collected GDP data by metropolitan area from 2001 to 2019. Using this data, we used a location quotient index, which is an analytical tool that compares industries in a given area to that of a larger geographical area. Location quotients were calculated as an industry share of a regional total for a specific economic variable, and was then divided by the industry share of the national total or that of a larger region for the same variable. We also used industry GDP coefficients that were calculated by taking the annual GDP from each industry, plotting it, and taking a singular linear regression for which a trend line was created for each industry. A second set of PICS tables were constructed to identify and compare industry trends over time in each of the 3 target cities to develop context for the investigation of industrial performance post-COVID. These location quotients were recalculated using the 3-year averages for 2003, 2008, and 2013, as well as their final state in 2019. The GDP coefficients were based on change over an 18-year span. GIS methods will now be described by Sarah Martin.
Thanks, Josh. Our spatial analysis drew on data from the sources listed here and was used to analyze the employment of residents by census tract based on the 2015 NAICS data, which stands for North American Industry Classification System, and the spatial distribution of evictions in each city. We conducted a hotspot analysis using the GetUsOrg tool to understand where evictions were most prominent in each city. Next, we mapped the employment of individuals in the city with a focus on employment in growing and declining sectors within eviction hotspots. We used this analysis to look for links between the changing landscape of employment in different sectors and evictions. Due to the difficulty in collecting recent, accurate, and reliable eviction data, we were required to reference different data sources and years of evictions for each city. We'll discuss the importance and implications of this data gap in more detail later, but for the time being, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to discuss our qualitative analysis.
The method of the interview team was to obtain qualitative data through interviews and news media to confirm truth, the economic and spatial analysis, and to also provide local context to national policy discourse. Stakeholder interviews were conducted, and this included researchers, housing advocates, and experts, and as well as residents. And now I'll be passing it on to Nathaniel.
We conducted a literature review of existing eviction-related policy and policy proposals. To help us understand the landscape of eviction policy, we created a policy typology to categorize strategies by level of implementation, which includes federal, state, and local government, and scope of economic hardship, discrete, indefinite, and structural. These scopes of hardship help us understand kind of the nature of economic disruptions that can potentially lead to eviction or housing instability. Discrete hardship is usually a specific event. It could be a funeral expense or a car repair or a natural disaster, but it's bounded and usually, is recovered from. Indefinite hardship is usually unemployment. It doesn't have a set end date and can stretch on indefinitely. And finally, structural hardship is created by disconnects between a renter's economic prospect and their housing options, where it's just challenging to get jobs in an area that would allow for affordable housing. We coded every policy strategy we encountered to a dyad of level and scope, although many policies can occur at multiple levels of government and impact multiple forms of hardship. We're now going to pivot to our city-by-city analysis, starting with Buffalo and Josh for our PICS analysis.
Thank you, Nathaniel. As shown in the 2019 PICS panel for the city of Buffalo to the right, including forestry, fishing, and mining, were experiencing decline. Housing-related industries like real estate actually experienced higher employment than the national average based on the 3-year average of the location quotient, while housing industries like construction faced decline and employment challenges. When looking at the comparison PICS from 2003 to 2019 for the city of Buffalo, the overall trend of Buffalo's industrial location quotient was downward, with the vast decline in industries such as utilities, mining, and forestry activities. From 2003 to 2019, housing-related industries like real estate began to decline in terms of employment average, while housing industries like construction remained relatively stable. A majority of industries in Buffalo were categorized as weak and declining, with a little more than half of these industries showing a declining trend from 2003 to 2019. Both real estate and construction industries showed signs of improvement, and there were many industries that experienced nonlinear growth. In this chart, we can see that in Buffalo from 2003 to 2019, industries including real estate, finance and insurance, and management of companies saw the largest amount of growth during this time period, while utilities, administrative support and healthcare, and social assistance saw the largest decline. The growth and stability seen in housing and related industries like real estate, even amongst the perils of the COVID-19 pandemic, may be useful in guiding some policies and recommendations to implement to help the city of Buffalo deal with this ongoing crisis. I will then pass it off to Evan Dash.
Thank you, Josh. The map on the left shows evictions by zip code for 2017 in the city of Buffalo. The highest concentration of evictions occurred in zip code 14215, which is on the east side of Buffalo and includes University at Buffalo's South Campus. Another area of high eviction rates occurred in 14207, which consists of the Black Rock neighborhood. The map on the right shows the Geddes or hotspot analysis of this data, highlighting the zip codes with significantly more eviction filings compared to the rest of the zip codes. 14215 has a much higher ratio of evictions compared to the rest of the city. The next three maps indicate the three NAICS industry sectors that experienced the most growth in Buffalo between 2003 and 2019. Note the purple outline, which denotes the 4 zip codes identified as eviction hotspots in the previous slide. We included this overlay to identify employment in industries that experienced the greatest growth and greatest decline in eviction hotspots. The first sector is management. The percentage of workers employed in this field hovered around 3 to 4% for the vast majority of census tracts within Buffalo. A smaller amount of census tracts had management employment rates of 0 to 2%. The next growing industry was financial services. Parkside, Elmwood Bidwell, Downtown, and the University Heights neighborhoods had the highest percentage of workers in this industry. The overall rates within the city hovered around 3 to 10%. The last growing industry highlighted was real estate, where the overall percentage of workers was largely between 1 to 2%. One census tract on the east side of the city had lower rates. The next three maps show the distribution of workers in industries that showed the greatest decline between 2003 and 2019. Healthcare, which is a very large industry in Buffalo, has been declining. There is a large percentage of healthcare workers living on the east side and Elmwood Bidwell neighborhoods. This percentage is around 21 to 31% of the working population in these census tracts. This map shows administrative services, another weak and declining sector. The percentage of workers in the highlighted eviction hotspot zip code is roughly equal to the rates around the city, which is around 6 to 15%. The last map shows the concentration of workers within utilities. Overall, the concentration of workers in this industry is similar throughout Buffalo at around 0%, with some census tracts reaching 2% of the population working in this field. 2 out of the 3 highlighted strong industries showed relatively high employment within the eviction hotspot zip codes. This included management and finance. 2 out of the 3 highlighted declining industries showed relatively high employment within the eviction hotspot zip codes. This included healthcare and administrative services. The next speaker will be Sarah Martin.
Thanks, Evan. We're going to start on our analysis of industry growth and decline and evictions in Detroit. And I'm going to start by passing it off to Ted to talk about our PICS analysis.
Thank you, Sarah. For Detroit, you can see that real estate is the strongest of the local industries, being the only industry currently both strong and growing. The other standout is the information industry, which has a negative and thus declining GDP. Detroit has the highest rate of variation in trends. Because a lot of this volatility falls between 2003 and 2008, we suspect there is some correlation with the 2008 economic crisis, but it's tough to verify causation with specific events. The nonlinear trends are highlighted in bold and are illustrated by directional arrows. For example, manufacturing dropped and then recovered. They show as 9 of the 13 industries represented in the weak categories. Because of Detroit's volatility, trend analysis is the least reliable for predictive models, as several that showed improvement overall had begun to downward trend by 2019. Also, because of the volatility in Detroit, overall improvements and declines were relatively small. The past volatility of Detroit suggests that it may be vulnerable to COVID-related economic repercussions, which will need to be accounted for when determining policy. And now back to Sarah.
The eviction data for Detroit was collected from the University of Michigan Poverty Solutions report published in April 2020 on evictions and rental ordinance enforcement. The data reflects eviction by zip code in Detroit in 2019. Our hotspot analysis indicates that 4 zip codes in Detroit were eviction hotspots in 2019, all within Detroit's West Side neighborhood. The next 3 maps indicate the 3 NAICS industry sectors that experienced the most growth in Detroit between 2003 and 2019. The first of these 3 is the manufacturing industry. Again, you can see the purple outline, which denotes the 4 eviction-prone zip codes in Detroit. Note here that employment by census tract within these hotspots for manufacturing is relatively low compared to the select tracts in the Jefferson Corridor, East Side, and Southwest Detroit neighborhoods. The NAICS sector, other non-government services, includes employment in repair and maintenance, personal care services, for-profit and not-for-profit activities, and household services. Throughout the city and within eviction hotspots, employment in this sector remained relatively similar between census tracts. The third industry which experienced the greatest growth between 2003 and 2019 was transportation. Employment in transportation within eviction hotspots was generally similar to the percentage of employees in this sector throughout the whole city. The next 3 maps show the 3 industries that experienced the greatest decline between 2003 and 2019. The first map shows management of companies. Note that while employment in this industry is most concentrated among residents who live close to the downtown neighborhood, a majority of census tracts within the eviction-prone zip codes in the West Side report a relatively large proportion of workers in management of companies. This is a potential cause for concern in these already eviction-prone zip codes if the industry continues to experience sustained decline. The arts and entertainment industry experienced similarly low employment throughout Detroit, both within and outside of eviction hotspots. The lack of differentiation between the employment within and outside of eviction hotspots does not indicate a clear link between the decline of the arts and entertainment industry in Detroit and housing instability in eviction hotspots. Finally, the administrative and waste management industry in Detroit employs a relatively high percentage of workers throughout the city and including in eviction-prone zip codes. The drop of employment in this industry between 2003 and 2019 may have negative impacts on the future of job and housing stability, as it employs a relatively large sector of the population, but has experienced a sustained decline. Here you can see a summary of our findings from our spatial analysis, which shows that these listed industries were relatively prevalent within eviction hotspots. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ted to give us an introduction to Pittsburgh.
All right, moving on to industry and eviction analysis in Pittsburgh. As before, you can see a snapshot of the current industry situation in Pittsburgh. The transportation and retail trade industries are the front runners. Real estate is also seeing some growth. The trends for location quotient are clustered much more tightly in Pittsburgh, and while trends can be identified, they are much smaller than previously seen in Buffalo or Detroit. This indicates a history of ongoing industrial stability for Pittsburgh and suggests a certain economic durability in the face of COVID. As you can see, the more industries improved than declined by 2019, and there's little in the way of nonlinear progression. Again, this suggests durability with improving industries likely to continue improving even if only incrementally. Here you have the table illustrating change between 2003 and 2019, most of the change being modest, with standouts being transportation and warehousing and agriculture in terms of growth, and mining and quarrying and finance and insurance for decline. And I now pass it on to Ashra Musset for the eviction hotspot analysis.
Thank you, Ted. These maps were generated using Eviction Maps 2020 dashboard data for Pittsburgh. This tool tracked eviction filings by zip code throughout all of 2020. The map on the left shows this data as a scale from 0 to the maximum of 246. The map on the right shows the Geddes-Ord hotspot analysis of this data, highlighting the zip codes with significantly more eviction filings. These zip codes were 15208, 15221, and 15227. The neighborhoods included in these zip codes are Point Breeze, Holmwoods, East Hills, Hayes, and Carrick. The next three maps show industries that, based on the PICS analysis, showed the greatest growth between 2003 and 2019 in Pittsburgh. For example, this first map shows the distribution of transportation and warehousing workers. Again, the highlighted zip codes are those that were considered hotspots for eviction based on the Eviction Lab 2020 data. The distribution of workers in this industry across Pittsburgh is relatively even, and within the zip codes that showed high eviction rates, this percentage fluctuates from around 6 to 15%. This map shows another strong and growing industry, administrative and waste management services. There are higher percentages of workers located in Homewood and East Hills at around 11 to 15%, and less in the Hayes and Carrick neighborhoods at around 6 to 10%. This last strong and growing industry map shows workers within the agriculture industry. Overall, there are extremely low numbers of workers in this field, and the only census tract that has over 1% of workers in this industry is Lincoln, Leamington, Belmar. This does not show a clear link between this growing industry and the hotspot zip codes. The following three maps show the distribution of workers in industries that showed the greatest decline based on the PICS analysis between 2003 and 2019. This map shows the distribution of workers in the mining and quarrying industry. The distribution of workers for this industry in the eviction hotspots is relatively low at approximately 1 to 2%. This map shows another weak and declining industry, manufacturing. The highlighted eviction hotspot zip codes show comparatively higher concentration of workers within this industry, with about 2 to 5% of the population working in this field. This could be a cause for concern for residents within the hotspot zip codes if this industry continues to show a pattern of decline. This last map shows the concentration of workers within finance and insurance. While the higher concentrations of this industry are located within the central business district downtown, there is still a relatively high employment in this industry within the hotspot zip codes at around 6 to 10%. 2 out of 3 of the strong growing industries showed relatively high employment within the eviction hotspot zip codes. These industries were transportation and administrative and waste management services. Additionally, there were 2 industries that were weak and declining that had high concentrations of workers within the hotspot zip codes, and those are manufacturing and finance and insurance. I'm going to pass it back to Ted.
Thank you, Ashra. So to reiterate the key takeaways for each city, while there were opportunities in Buffalo, the overall trend is downward, and that will likely impact policy decisions. The volatility of Detroit's industry makes predicting trends difficult. Detroit may be particularly susceptible to economic repercussions associated with COVID-19. And Pittsburgh has the most stability in industrial trends, indicating a more durable economy on which to build policy. And now on to Sarah.
Thanks, Ted. So the approach we used focused on the analysis of growing and declining industry sectors in eviction hotspots. We chose this method of analysis rather than an analysis of unemployment within and outside of eviction hotspots because unemployment rates do not necessarily correlate with eviction rates in any of these cities, as exemplified by the 3 maps here. While some of the census tracts with high unemployment rates are sometimes located in eviction hotspots, there are several areas with high unemployment that are not correlated with high evictions. Our spatial analysis led us to conclude that the listed industries under growing throughout the 3 cities are industry sectors that are viable targets for economic growth and development strategies. If these industries continue their upward trajectory of growth, we would predict an increase in housing stability in these eviction hotspots because of an improvement in job stability for residents. Additionally, our spatial analysis indicates that there is a need for concentrated economic development strategies for the industries listed under declining throughout the 3 cities, because there is a high percentage of residents working in these industries who also live in eviction hotspots. In Buffalo, for instance, healthcare is a crucial industry in which a large percentage of residents living in eviction hotspots are employed. If the healthcare industry continues to decline in Buffalo, these residents are more likely to face additional economic hardship and housing instability. And with the end of our discussion on our spatial and PICS analysis, I'm going to pass this on to Zach to talk about current policies.
Thank you. Moving on to current policy, we examined what is offered federally and locally to aid those experiencing hardships during the pandemic. The CDC has imposed a federal moratorium that's focused on decreasing the spread of COVID caused by excessive evictions and rehousing. This is superseded by state moratoria, but protects those in states without their own. Currently, the housing court is closed in Buffalo and Pittsburgh, but open in Detroit. It is important to note that in Buffalo and Pittsburgh, while the housing court is closed, they are still allowing for the filing of paperwork for evictions. Buffalo falls under the New York State moratorium, which has been criticized for its focus on weeding out fraud rather than proactive protection and its limited scope in terms of what it does protect. The same could be said of the state rental assistance program. Pittsburgh has its own citywide ban on evictions, due in part to its membership to the National League of Cities Eviction Prevention Council, which was formed shortly before the pandemic. I do want to note, though, that Pittsburgh has recently met and discussed extending their moratorium indefinitely, but decreasing what it does cover. Detroit does not have a state or city level ban, instead opting for rental assistance programs, which have much of the same requirements as New York's. As far as resources go, these are things provided by the municipality online, through phone calls, or in person to navigate eviction concerns and assistance at this time. The limited resources Buffalo was able to provide were skewed heavily towards landlords. These are things like FAQs on how to file evictions, but this most likely has not been updated since the pandemic had started. Pittsburgh has a good balance of information for both landlords and tenants, and notably has a housing court help desk in person to walk people through any questions. Detroit had more tenant-sided resources, which were located primarily online. I now hand it off to Justin to discuss our comparative analysis.
So as part of the investigative process that we outlined previously, we conducted interviews with residents, experts, and community activists for a qualitative perspective on the state of housing during COVID. Our discussion centered around the origins of unaffordability in the housing market and causation of rising evictions in our 3 study areas, as well as anticipated trends that will occur after COVID resides. The quotes on this page capture some of the dialogue surrounding the current crisis. So for example, one nonprofit leader mentioned the need for education tied to potential rental assistance. A senior regional planner spoke on the need to address transportation inequities, especially in communities that are highly impacted by evictions. A senior fellow at an advocacy think tank highlights the culture of housing court as an obstacle for housing security, and one that is heavily skewed towards protecting landlords, as mentioned previously. And a former Detroit resident explains how revitalization eludes certain neighborhoods, while others are targeted for multi-million-dollar investment, in the case of Detroit being the downtown area. And last but not least, finally, we have an academic that reminds us that COVID has only exacerbated the critical need for housing. And to carry on with the recommendations, Allison will be speaking on the next slide.
We created 2 sets of policy recommendations: direct preventions and housing stability. Direct preventions are recommendations that we made based on the issues our team found within the current policies that are in place. And housing stability are recommendations made for long-term systemic and structural changes. Our recommendations are intended for the city level implementation, but can be used and improved with support at the state and federal level. For our first set of policies, we focus on direct preventions of evictions, which would allow immediate relief for those who are most vulnerable to evictions. These interventions include extending eviction moratoria, having smart rental assistant, and implementing housing court reforms and landlord-tenant education program. Throughout our research, we kept coming across a common theme that more financial assistance should be provided to those in need, but there isn't a lot of follow-up on how to implement this particular suggestion. For our smart rental assistant recommendation, we are suggesting a shallow rental subsidy program that can be tailored to household needs.
Currently, housing court is a process that summons tenants to be judged in a convoluted system that rarely warrants them a say. Shifting that framework to one that welcomes mediation rather than prioritizing punitive responses can help even the playing fields for landlords and tenants. Ideally, through partnerships with local mediation services, each municipality can ensure eviction is not the first option. With this, a fairly simple and more immediate solution is the creation and maintenance of online and in-person help desks to lower the barrier of entry to the legalese. Finally, extend current moratoria indefinitely rather than constantly playing catch-up. Part of this is due to the public health motivations of the moratoria, which do not accurately reflect the hardships people are facing at this time. Once herd immunity is achieved through vaccinations, the consequences of the pandemic do not suddenly stop. State-level protection programs should be expanded to ensure blanket protections for all evictions, as well as decreasing the requirements for aid rather than searching for fraud. Again, with the current system, once moratoria is lifted, we still need to figure out what to do in cases of back rent. States should cancel back rent and work out alternative methods to aid landlords who may also be behind on mortgage payments. I'll now hand it off to Nathaniel to discuss our long-term recommendations.
Our second set of policy recommendations is focused on structural and systemic changes that can reduce the overall likelihood of evictions and housing instability. This entails a diverse range of strategies grouped in data, economic development, and housing stock. It's very difficult to shape and enforce good policy without good data. Currently available national data on evictions are fragmented, scattered, non-descriptive, and focused only on eviction judgments. Standardizing data collection across cities and making databases accessible to researchers and the public will improve accountability. Cities should collect data to track both the movement of renters through the eviction system, including evictions that are prevented, as well as who's doing the evicting, and extra-legal and informal evictions. As our PICS and GIS analyses illustrated, the industry in which a renter works can have a substantial impact on their level of eviction risk or housing stability. Programs that provide vulnerable residents with pathways into strengthening and investing industries in particular can buffer risk. Simultaneously, eviction prevention programs can be targeted at workers in vulnerable or declining industries. Finally, implementing living wage policies will help close the gaps caused by structural economic hardships. There are many ways that cities can ensure the equitable production and allocation of naturally affordable housing. Local ordinances, inclusive zoning, and city property disposition policies can ensure that developers build diverse housing that is appropriate to the needs and means of residents. Housing rehabilitation programs maintain the cohesion of the urban fabric and improve renter tenure. Finally, organizations like community land trusts can ensure that housing remains affordable over the long term. With the conclusion of our policy recommendations, I'll pass it over to Ashra for our summary and conclusion.
The mixed analysis method allowed our studio to look at more than just housing availability in our analysis of evictions pre-COVID and during 2020. This enabled a deeper level of analysis that can connect employment trends, evictions, and demographics to determine which neighborhoods are more at risk within the 3 Rust Belt cities. Using the interviews and existing policy analysis, our studio recommended multiple levels of intervention into the existing housing market to assist in preventing evictions both short and long term. These include the creation and usage of best practices for rental assistance and increased data collections on evictions. New and existing policies should be reviewed with a people-centered approach, prioritizing tenants' needs over landlords and other stakeholders. The effects of COVID-19 are ongoing, and there must be continued research in these cities to address the economic and social impacts of eviction, as well as increasing the quantity and quality of affordable housing. And I'm going to turn it to Nathaniel and Jackson for the conclusion.
Thank you, Ashra. That is the conclusion of our presentation. Once again, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I know we have people tuning in from all over the world, and it has been our honor to present to all of you today. We will now open the floor to questions and comments. Feel free to raise your hand or post questions in the YouTube or WebEx chat boxes.
Thank you so much, Jackson, and then all of our students. It's a wonderful presentation, and all are well recorded. So thank you so much for your presentations and demonstration of your outcome. Rob and Sarah, as a guest, you are invited here, and if you have any questions, please do it here. We really happy to support the questions and the answers from us. Actually, Rob and Sarah, if you can turn on your video, that would be better for us to make capture your face. So that would be great. Rob, do you have any questions?
You're muted, sir.
Rob, you are muted.
Yeah, sorry, Dr. Silverman. Your audio is coming in real patchy.
I can ask a
Sure.
question while I was typing up his. Sarah Wooten with the Partnership of the Public Good. Really appreciated your all's presentation. Yeah, I guess I was wondering, because this reminds me a lot of the work that PPG did with our study in evictions. And one thing that we really came up against again and again was the difficulties in getting that eviction data. So I was curious in you're looking at other eviction data from the other cities, whether what they were collecting and what kind of specific points of data we might be collecting here that we're not. Because in my experience, the courts aren't collecting a whole lot, at least digitally.
I can take a crack at that and then pass it over to the GIS team. Based on some research that the Eviction Lab has done, the eviction data that tends to be available locally only tracks evictions that are carried through all the way to judgment. So the evictions that actually happen. It doesn't track But we know that many tenants, upon receiving the eviction filing or the notice to evict, may undergo a forced move without even going through the process. So that's not tracked, right? All of these sorts of forced moves that happen outside of the formal eviction process. There's also very little information that's being tracked about who is evicting. It's much easier to find out if someone has been evicted multiple times, but we don't have good handles save by like scraping and like building these data sets from scratch. Cities are not collecting data on which landlords are frequent eviction filers. So that, coupled with just like basic demographic data, and I see the question from Professor Silverman is part of this as well. At least according to the Eviction Lab, there is no current tracking on like the size of the rent deficit that leads to an eviction notice. So we don't know, for example, the average quantity of owed rent that generates an eviction filing. I don't know if GFX team want to add anything to that.
If I could add something to that, Nathaniel, I think you bring up a really interesting point to Dr. Silverman's question about, how much are people usually behind on rent before evictions are filed. And I think one thing that we learned in speaking with different professionals who deal with evictions throughout these 3 study cities is that, it doesn't necessarily always have to do purely with the numbers, right? Like there is a problem in some cities, even if technically it's illegal to do this, but landlords will strike an agreement with their tenants to give them more time to pay their rent or get caught up. But let's say a tenant has a problem with, a drain that's clogged, or there are other maintenance issues that need to be taken care of. A lot of tenants, unfortunately, live in this fear of calling building inspectors or reporting code violations because they're behind on rent. And so these tenants are forced to accept really subpar living conditions in order not to get evictions. So that's another, reality that people are dealing with who are struggling with their rent, that although it's, on the books, it's not legal, it still happens. And it's something that's difficult to capture in all of our data. One of the maps that we created just while we were getting a background idea of what the housing stock looked like in our cities was how old is the housing stock? Because that's another thing we have to think about. There's not always an awareness of the quality or lack thereof of houses that folks who are struggling to get on top of their rent and who are facing eviction might be living in. And we found a lot of these cities, they have very old housing stock. So a lot of these houses have a lot of issues and problems. And it's just another cause for concern that, again, is difficult to capture in the data.
And then if I could add,
I'm going to jump.
Sorry, Justin. I just wanted to say real quick, there's definitely not a shortage of news stories that kind of paint this picture of the struggling landlord who's been letting people slide on back rent, but really just needs policy to change in his favor. So there's no real data collection of those things, but there's definitely a lot of cases and a lot of stories of that happening.
So I'll add to this conversation. For the Buffalo analysis, our biggest source of data was that PPG report from 2018, which was really a treasure trove. But the data on evictions came from neighborhood legal services and volunteer lawyers projects. So they seem to be organizations that are handling a lot of evictions and collecting data around the country, the different iterations and network organizations within their networks. But what we found too is that people are very secretive when it comes to revealing that information. So for starters, cities and municipalities don't want people to know what the eviction rate is, or they're not willing to put that out if they even keep track of it. but also these organizations too, you know, they're very secretive. And I think one of the reasons is because there is that culture of, you know, of land, sort of the antagonism between landlords and tenants, and, you know, tenants fearing backlash and repercussions from landlords. So there is a sort of aura of secrecy about revealing this information. And as you know, Eviction Lab is really the first cohesive place where all these metrics are collected. And in the case of Buffalo, it's not even on the Eviction Lab. So, you know, the biggest thing that we've uncovered in all of this project is just, you know, as Nathaniel mentioned, there's just a lack of data collection, and even people collecting it aren't necessarily sharing amongst themselves.
Thank you, Justin. In response to our responses to Dr. Silverman's question, he had a follow-up question. He said, I understand that there are some approaches to make landlords by whole creating programs to cover their unpaid rent from tenants, but once they are made whole, how do the policies prevent future evictions if the tenants continue not to pay? I'm going to pass this question on to Zach Karosh, and I believe Ashra Musa is going to have a follow-up.
So the answer to that is kind of in our moratoria recommendations. So ideally, by extending them indefinitely, we can kind of cover a little bit more blanket and give people a little bit more time to work out ways to pay. And then also with this, just expanding what is covered and lessening the requirements for rental assistance. So ideally, there kind of be a lot stronger programs that, so in the case of New York, the application is quite lengthy and feedback time and the wait list is kind of long as well. And then with that, a lot of people say that when they do hear back from them, they're suspected of fraud. So kind of lowering stuff like that, where we're not weeding out fraud, but more so going into it with the intentions that people who are going to be using these services care more so and actually need these services. And then with that, ideally through covering landlords who also have to pay for their mortgages by implementing some sort of state level or federal level program, you can cover them so they might not need that back pay from residents, which would ideally also stop the evictions.
Yeah, I think Zach covered that very well. All I was going to add was that one of the stakeholders that we spoke with throughout this process emphasized the idea of financial education. So, you know, talking about like best practices with rental assistance and possibly including financial education along with that could be a component that could really help with the longer term payment for rent for these individuals that choose to take advantage of those programs. But I mostly just agree with everything Zach said as well.
One thing I'll add to that response is to highlight, we just had a little banner photo of it, but the DC Flex program, which was our model for this shallow, flexible subsidy recommendation, what really works towards this question of preventing recidivism when it comes to eviction. And part of that is the program doesn't wait until there is a rental emergency. The flexible part of that speaks to identifying the needs of vulnerable renters before they are in a rental emergency, and developing financial assistance or other forms of assistance to meet their needs before it gets to the point of an eviction filing. So that hopefully works to develop some financial stability and economic stability for